opportunity to get to know each other a bit better. Now, to get the afternoon started, we'd like to call to the podium Mr. Alfredo1, who is Executive Vice President of Acacia Research, one of the more active companies of the last couple of decades, I think, in commercialization of intellectual property. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Just by way of introduction, my name is Alfredo1. I am Executive VP of Acacia Research. We are a leader in intellectual property monetization. We have an extensive client list. Some of the better known companies would be companies like Renesas Electronics, a very large Japanese semiconductor company, Boston Scientific in the medical technology space. We have associations with Rambus, which Suzanne mentioned earlier, Silicon Image, which is a small semiconductor company with some very compelling and key technology. And so, but I myself am not an IP attorney. I'm an electrical engineer by training, and I spent the bulk of my career focused on semiconductors and wireless technology development. And so the examples that I'll run through are examples of my career and how in the trends that we see today in Europe, US, and China about commercialization, monetization, and valuation of intellectual property, which, by the way, my own personal opinion is that those three are three distinct and different things. So why don't we get started? When you're looking at monetizing intellectual property, that is taking the patent asset that Suzanne did a great job of explaining how a company can strategically develop their IP management strategy effectively and for maximization of return. Monetization, from my perspective, means taking now that patent asset and converting it into a revenue stream. And so, of course, the default one is commercialization. There are companies that even, and I'll talk a little bit about tech transfer, but for the most part, companies that come into existence do so to deliver a product or a service, and if they're a product-oriented company, they're going to spend a lot of time doing research and development. There are companies that focus on what I would call pre-infringement licensing. That is, they have compelling intellectual property and technology that they've developed that they wish to share it and generate the revenue stream by transferring that knowledge of that. And there are some very, very successful companies that have that as their core business model. Probably the one, again, biased by my own experience, but the one that jumps to mind for me is ARM Limited out of the UK. They're a company that developed processors. They began with a very focused strategy around cell phones in the mid-90s, and today are the de facto engine that powers both the modems as well as the application processors for practically every mobile device on Earth. I can't think of a more successful company that has never physically built a product. They've built the know-how, they've built the technology, they've built the intellectual property, and they transfer all of that to any company that wishes to use it. And so they've been incredibly, incredibly successful. And of course, there's post-infringement licensing. That is to say, once you've had your patents developed and you've attempted to commercialize a product, maybe you've been successful, maybe you haven't. Maybe you've exited a business and your company is now transitioning, and you have what's left. You have some patent assets, and you find that there are folks that are using those assets without an appropriate license. And so, how do you go about determining that infringement is taking place and asserting those patents and essentially forcing a license? So let's talk about a little bit of some of those trends in some of the different regions. And again, this is in no particular order, but kind of going back to commercialization. So the gist of it is you're obviously have to research and develop product and inventions are a result of that effort. And that effort can consume hundreds of millions of dollars. When I started my career with Texas Instruments in 1996, it was the first year that TI had actually consolidated a group of separate standalone custom businesses into TI's wireless-focused business unit. And so I don't recall the exact budget at the beginning, but I can tell you that at the end of my career, when I was responsible for the worldwide business development of our 3G modem chipset, we were spending upwards of $500 million a year in R&D for the productization of our modems and our application processors. Before the end of that decade, before 2010, TI had announced the exit of that business. So obviously a company with the pedigree and age of TI and the success. When I left, we were still #1 in shipping modems, and a short 5 years later, TI had completely exited the business. And so those are different factors that come into play, but certainly that amount of R&D over the course of a decade and a half, you start to question just how much actual return on investment a company like that has been able to generate. Once you, of course, complete the R&D and you patent the inventions, you have to successfully roll out that product. And so even if you have the successful R&D, even if you have the successful result of patents that have compelling inventions that are going to become kind of the de facto ideas upon which other products are built, if you're yourself, your mission is to commercialize that product, then you have other extenuating factors to consider in being successful or not being successful with that commercialization. And for that, I'll use another example. In 2007, I joined a startup in San Diego called NextWave Wireless, and we were focused on the development of modem technology for 4G, so the next evolution of the wireless technology after 3G. And we were very successful as a startup in developing our chipset solutions with about 200 patents that resulted over a 3-year effort. The startup actually began in 2005. I joined in 2007. We amassed a very compelling list of about 24 worldwide customers, both in China, in Taiwan, in Japan, and in the US. So we had certainly all the markings to be successful. Our product was coming out of the foundries. It was testing positive, so we had done a good job, and we were sure success was right around the corner. And then the global economy slowed to a halt. All orders pushed out, and NextWave could not survive. So the resulting took about a year to unwind the company and shut it down. And the last remaining asset that NextWave possessed was the intellectual property portfolio of about 200 assets, which was successful in being sold. And so even commercialization, even when the intentions are pure, success is certainly not guaranteed. And even when you execute all of your strategies accordingly, it doesn't guarantee you success. Different industries have different metrics for what percentage of R&D actually results in a commercialized product that then is also profitable. But it's not uncommon that in the semiconductor or wireless world, that can be as low as 25%. So for every dollar that you're investing, you're getting 25% return on it. Okay, so again, with the exception of governments that are stimulating investment in certain technologies, you see that result pretty consistent across the different regions. In US, there's a high percentage of startup failure, as there is in Europe, as there is in China. And of course, we tend to hear more of the successful startups and the successful technology companies. But at least when I was doing a little bit of research for today, I couldn't find any marked pattern that would suggest that other than when governments decide to take a proactive investment in certain technologies to build out that core competency in that particular country, the returns don't vary that much regionally. So let's turn a little bit to pre-infringement licensing or carrot licensing or technology transfer. And in that, you want to find somebody that can benefit from your invention, which means thank you. Which means that the invention actually not just has to be useful for what you want to achieve, but it also has to be successful for what a variety of other people want to achieve. And let's turn back to the example of ARM. ARM cores began with the idea of being sufficiently powerful in a very low power consumption mode for mobile devices so that you could extend the battery life. Well, today you find 64-bit ARM cores in servers. Certainly there's no requirement for power efficiency other than for environmental purposes because you're plugged in to the wall essentially, right? And so you can see the idea that if you can come up with something that has utility value beyond just perhaps what you've scoped it out for, there can be a market, but that market is always going to be dependent on somebody finding that to be valuable. And there's many examples. Again, relying on my background, modem protocol stacks. There was a very successful company from France called TTPcom that developed some modem protocol stacks with heavy patent portfolio. It ended up being acquired by Motorola. We have technology that's emerging today for your mobile devices, again, to try to keep power consumption level down. It's called envelope tracking. Another very successful example of this is HDMI. Right now, HDMI is pretty ubiquitous. We all kind of know where that is. Well, the concept of HDMI and its development began with a company in Silicon Valley called Silicon Image. And they were very successful at not just coming up with an idea of how to go about transferring audio and video in a systemic way much more efficiently, so the kind of the nuts and bolts, but they were also very efficient at gathering other large consumer electronic companies, including Sony and Panasonic and Philips and others of that, to join together into a consortium to further develop it, further adopt it, and further launch it. And Silicon Image has been a very successful company, and most recently, Lattice Semiconductor acquired them. So I think you can definitely find many examples where proactive technology transfer licensing can be very successful. And regionally, it tends to be, I think, a question of how sophisticated, at least in the technology sector and certainly within the wireless space, how sophisticated are the companies and how mature are the companies in terms of its development. A decade ago in China, one of the first times I got to travel to China was to meet with a company I had never heard of and I wasn't quite sure how to pronounce. Their name was Huawei. Right now, they are one of the world leaders in telecommunication equipment, and their patent portfolio has grown orders of magnitude. Right? And so I think, certainly if you track the development of their intellectual property portfolio, as they've grown more sophisticated, because at first they as opposed to inventing things, they were consuming technology from other companies, putting together those into their own products and then selling those in both the domestic market and very beginning parts of taking it to foreign markets. Now, of course, they're one of the leading innovators in the emerging 5G wireless technology standard. So, are there some perils for technology transfer licensing outside of the fact that you kind of have to look into the future as you're developing this technology, and you kind of have to, especially if it's going to be patented technology as opposed to something that's more know-how centric, and that in and of itself is difficult enough to try to forecast the